The Conclave of 12 did not declare war on humanity out of hatred. They declared war out of fear, and that distinction in the end made all the difference. The session transcripts, recovered years later and translated by xenolinguists at the University of São Paulo, paint a picture that is almost clinical in its detachment. 14 hours of deliberation. 87 procedural motions. A final vote of 9-3 in favor of Resolution 7 Gamma, the preemptive stabilization of the Sol system. That was the official language. The diplomatic language. The honest translation was simpler. Eliminate humanity before it becomes a problem we cannot solve. To understand why 12 alien civilizations looked at a species that had not yet left its own solar system and decided it needed to be exterminated, you have to understand what the Conclave had seen. They had watched humanity for 63 years, quietly, carefully, from observation posts disguised as debris fields at the edges of the Kuiper Belt. They had studied every war, every famine response, every industrial revolution, every generation of weapons technology. They had fed their data into predictive models refined over 4,000 years of interstellar political science. Every single model returned the same result. Within 300 years, humanity would be the most dangerous spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy. Not the largest, not the most numerous, but the most dangerous, in the way a scalpel is more dangerous than a hammer, in the way a surgeon with steady hands is more dangerous than a soldier with a rifle. The models flagged human adaptability, human improvisation under pressure, and, most disturbingly, the human tendency to escalate asymmetrically. To respond to a punch with a sledgehammer. To respond to a sledgehammer with something the models couldn't fully predict. The Conclave strategists called it the volatility index. Humanity scored higher than any species they had ever catalogued. So they voted. And on a Tuesday morning in March 2271, while 3 billion people on Earth were waking up, making coffee, arguing about politics, raising children, writing music, falling in love, a fleet of 47 warships crossed the heliopause and began their approach toward the inner solar system. They expected to find a civilization unprepared for war on an interstellar scale. They were not wrong about that. What they were wrong about was the assumption that unpreparedness was the same as vulnerability. The first indication that something was wrong came from Solwatch Station Alpha, a joint ESA-NASA deep space monitoring installation positioned at L4, the gravitational equilibrium point 60 degrees ahead of Earth in its orbit around the Sun. Solwatch had been operational since 2248, designed originally to track near-Earth asteroids and monitor solar weather patterns. Over time, its mandate had quietly expanded. The station's sensor arrays had been upgraded 4 times in 12 years, each upgrade justified to the public with different civilian rationale. Better asteroid mapping, solar flare prediction, long-range communication relay testing. The real reason was simpler. Someone in the Unified Defense Directorate, a man named Admiral Yusuf Okafor, who had spent 30 years thinking carefully about first contact scenarios, had looked at humanity's history of being surprised and decided that never again was worth the cost of a very expensive telescope. At 0314 UTC, March 14, Solwatch Alpha's upgraded passive sensor array detected gravitational displacement signatures at the heliopause consistent with large-scale mass transit. The duty officer on shift, a 26-year-old signals analyst from Lagos named Priya Nwosu, spent 11 minutes cross-referencing the data against every known natural phenomenon before she did what her training told her to do. She hit the red button. The alert cascaded through 17 layers of protocol in less than 4 minutes. By 0318, Admiral Okafor was on a secure line from his home in Nairobi to the Unified Defense Directorate's Emergency Coordination Center in Geneva. By 0330, the emergency session of the UN Security Council's Defense Subcommittee had convened virtually, with representatives joining from 11 time zones. By 0400, humanity knew it was not alone, and that whatever had arrived was not here to talk. The intercepted communication that confirmed hostile intent was decoded 6 hours later. The message was not addressed to any human government. It was a command transmission from the fleet's lead vessel to its support ships. Final approach vectors, engagement priorities, and a targeting catalog that included, in order, the L4 and L5 monitoring stations, the lunar defense installations, the Mars orbital platforms, and, listed with the same bureaucratic neutrality as everything else on the document, Earth itself. It was the targeting catalog that changed the tone in every room where it was read. There was no ultimatum. No demand for surrender. No attempt at communication. The Conclave had not sent diplomats. They had sent executioners, and they had sent enough of them to be certain. 47 warships against a species that had never fought a battle beyond its own atmosphere. The mathematics were straightforward. Where they should have been. Admiral Okafor looked at the targeting catalog for a long time before he spoke. The officers around him in the Geneva Coordination Center were waiting, some of them visibly shaken, some already calculating, all of them quiet in the particular way that people become quiet when history is being made in the same room where they are standing. When he finally spoke, what he said was not a speech. It was not a rallying cry. It was 9 words, delivered in a voice as flat and measured as a structural engineer reading a load-bearing calculation. Tell me everything we have and where it is. That was how humanity's first interstellar war began. Not with a declaration. Not with a battle cry. With an inventory. What the Conclave's models had not accounted for, what no outside observer could have fully accounted for, was 63 years of a species that had been quietly, persistently, almost obsessively preparing for the possibility that the universe was not empty, and that emptiness was not the same as safety. They had not built a fleet. But they had built something. And in 72 hours, the Conclave would begin to understand the difference. 72 hours. That was the window between the first confirmed detection of the Conclave fleet and the moment its lead elements would enter weapons range of the lunar defensive perimeter. 72 hours in which every decision humanity made would determine whether the species survived the next 10 days. The number sounds small. Against the scale of what was coming, it felt even smaller. But 72 hours is also 4,320 minutes. It is a long time when people stop sleeping. The first 12 hours were consumed by what military historians would later call the verification problem. No government on Earth, not the Unified Defense Directorate, not the Security Council, not any of the 17 independent national space agencies with monitoring capability, wanted to be the first to confirm that the data was real and act on it. The consequences of being wrong were catastrophic in one direction. The consequences of hesitating were catastrophic in the other. There was a 9-hour window, documented in excruciating detail across the post-war inquiry transcripts, where senior figures in 4 separate governments were simultaneously trying to verify the same data without telling each other they were doing so, out of a fear that sharing unconfirmed intelligence would trigger panic. It was Admiral Okafor who broke the paralysis. At hour 11 he sent a single encrypted message to his counterparts in the Chinese Strategic Space Command, the European Defense Coordination Authority, and the newly formed Indo-Pacific Orbital Defense Consortium. The message contained the Solwatch data, the decoded targeting catalog, and 2 sentences of his own. I am proceeding on the assumption that this is real. I recommend you do the same. Within 90 minutes, the paralysis ended. What followed was not the coordinated, smooth mobilization that post-war documentaries tend to suggest. The reality was messier, faster, and in many ways more impressive for its messiness. The Unified Defense Directorate had contingency plans for first contact scenarios. It had been developing them, quietly and without public acknowledgement, since 2231, when a classified astrophysics study had concluded that the probability of other technological civilizations existing within 1,000 light-years of Sol was statistically significant enough to warrant serious planning. Those plans had been updated 11 times in 40 years. They had never been tested at full scale. Several of their key assumptions were, within the first 18 hours of actual mobilization, revealed to be wrong. The plan assumed 6 weeks of warning. It assumed a fleet of no more than 20 vessels. It assumed that humanity would have time to communicate before hostilities began. None of those assumptions held. What held instead was the underlying architecture, the network of prepositioned assets, the command structure, the communication protocols, and most critically, the weapons platforms that had been quietly installed, upgraded, and maintained across the solar system over the previous 4 decades, under a dozen different cover programs and civilian infrastructure budgets. Commander Jiwoo Park, who led the hastily assembled Lunar Defense Coordination Center during those 72 hours, described the process in her post-war memoir as finding out what you actually have instead of what you planned to have, and making it work faster than you thought possible. What humanity actually had, it turned out, was this. 14 armed orbital platforms in Earth-Moon space, originally installed under the banner of asteroid deflection research. Each platform carried a rail acceleration system capable of launching 2-ton tungsten slugs at a significant fraction of orbital velocity. They had been designed, ostensibly, to redirect asteroids. Their actual targeting parameters had been quietly expanded, in 3 separate classified amendments spanning 20 years, to include anything approaching on a non-standard trajectory. 6 deep space relay stations, positioned between Earth and Mars, each carrying sensor arrays and, less officially, a suite of electronic warfare systems developed over 15 years of research into how an alien civilization might use electromagnetic communication. The Mars Orbital Defense Installation, officially the Mars Infrastructure Protection Platform, which housed humanity's first and only directed energy weapons system capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 50,000 kilometers. It had been operational for 4 years. It had never been used in combat. Its crew of 63 had run simulation drills every week for those 4 years, and were, as Commander Park would later note, terrifyingly ready. And then there were the drones. The autonomous weapons program had begun in 2244, buried inside a research budget line described as long-duration deep space exploration vehicle development. The engineers who built them had never been told explicitly what they were for. But they were smart people working on small, fast, highly maneuverable vehicles with redundant propulsion systems, no life support requirements, and payload bays sized exactly for kinetic warheads. They understood what they were building. Over 27 years, 4,400 of these vehicles had been produced, tested, and distributed across hiding positions throughout the inner solar system, tucked into asteroid shadows, floating in gravitational equilibria, attached to the undersides of registered mining platforms. Each one ran on a passive standby protocol, consuming minimal power, waiting. They had a very simple activation condition. If the Sawatch network detected a fleet approaching on a combat vector and the Directorate issued a green light authorization, every drone in the network would wake up. At hour 14 of the crisis, the Directorate issued green light. 4,312 drones woke up. The 60 hours that followed were a brutal exercise in triage. Okafor's coordination team worked through every asset, every position, every communication relay and weapons platform, building a picture of what they could actually defend and what they couldn't. The hard conversations happened in hours 20 through 30 behind closed doors, in rooms where no transcript was kept. The orbital platforms couldn't stop the fleet. The drones couldn't stop the fleet. The Mars installation couldn't stop the fleet. Nothing humanity had used in isolation could stop 47 warships built by civilizations that had been traveling between stars for millennia. What they had used together, in the right sequence, in the right positions, might do something else entirely. It might make the cost of conquest so high that the Conclave's 9-3 vote began to look like a miscalculation. It might buy time. Time for what, exactly, became the central strategic question of the final 48 hours. Time to negotiate, but the Conclave had sent no diplomat. Time to evacuate, but there was nowhere to evacuate 8 billion people. Time to prepare a counterstrike. But with what, and against targets humanity couldn't reach? The answer, when it came, was proposed not by a general or an admiral but by a 41-year-old civilian strategic analyst named Dr. Amara Osei, who had spent her career studying how asymmetric conflicts throughout human history had been resolved. Her proposal was 4 pages long. Its title was deliberately understated: Considerations for Asymmetric Response in the Current First Contact Scenario. When Okafor finished reading it, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long to implement?" 48 hours, she said. "If we start now. Then start now." The Conclave Fleet Commander's name, as best as human xenolinguists could later reconstruct it, translated approximately to Third Architect of Ordered Expansion, a title rather than a name, reflecting the Conclave's deeply hierarchical structure. For simplicity, the Directorate's intelligence team designated him Fleet Commander Triad. Triad had commanded 12 engagements in his career. He had never lost one. His fleet had suppressed 2 pre-spaceflight civilizations, enforced 3 blockades, and participated in the dissolution of 1 interstellar nation-state that the Conclave had deemed structurally unstable. He was, by any reasonable measure, experienced and competent. He had studied humanity's data profile for 6 months before departure. He had read every intercepted transmission, analyzed every energy signature, cataloged every installation his long-range scouts had identified. His battle planners had constructed 3 separate engagement scenarios, ranging from minimal resistance to organized but outmatched defense. He had prepared for all 3. What he had not prepared for was a 4th scenario: organized, outmatched, and deliberately unpredictable. The first engagement occurred not where Triad expected, not at the lunar perimeter where his calculations told him humanity's defensive assets were concentrated, but 2.3 million kilometers further out, in a region of space his scouts had categorized as empty. It was not empty. The drones hit the fleet's forward scout element at 0612 UTC on day 4 of the crisis. Not in a single coordinated wave, that would have been readable, predictable, something a fleet that had fought battles before would know how to respond to. Instead, they came in irregular intervals from irregular directions, in groups ranging from 4 to 40, using approach vectors that required Triad's defensive systems to track and engage threats coming from 6 different bearing vectors simultaneously. The scout element, 3 vessels, destroyed approximately 60% of the drones they encountered. That was an impressive performance. It was also exactly what Dr. Osei's models had predicted. The remaining 40% weren't there to destroy ships. They were there to gather data, close-range sensor passes on conclave hull materials, shield frequencies, point defense response times, minimum engagement intervals. Every drone that survived long enough to complete a pass transmitted its data back to the Lunar Coordination Center before being destroyed. The battle had lasted 9 minutes. Humanity had lost 847 drones and damaged, not destroyed, a single conclave scout vessel. By any traditional metric, it was a defeat. By Osei's metric, it was the most valuable 9 minutes in human military history. Triad was not alarmed by the drone attack. He was, by the accounts of his surviving staff officers, mildly impressed. He noted the irregular timing, flagged the data-gathering behavior as interesting, and revised his estimate of human tactical sophistication upward by a modest margin. He did not revise his overall assessment. 47 warships against a civilization that had resorted to using unmanned kamikaze probes was still a manageable equation. He adjusted his formation, a sensible precaution, and continued the advance. He was 40 hours from Earth when the second contact occurred. This one came from the Mars installation. Commander Yuan Li had commanded the Mars Orbital Defense Installation for 3 years. She had 63 crew members, a single directed energy weapon, and a very clear-eyed understanding of what her platform could and could not do against a fleet of 47 warships. What it could do was fire precisely, at long range, with a level of accuracy that her team had spent 4 years refining. What it could not do was survive return fire for more than a few minutes. She had discussed this with Okafor's team during the planning phase. Her contribution to Osei's strategy was a single tactical principle that she had proposed in characteristically blunt terms. I can't stop them. But I can make them look somewhere else for long enough. Her shot, a directed energy pulse targeted not at a warship hull but at the fleet's primary communication relay vessel, a support ship positioned near the center of the formation, hit at 1847 UTC. The relay vessel was not destroyed. It was disabled. Its communication systems went offline for 4 hours. 4 hours during which the fleet's internal network fragmented. During which the 17 forward attack vessels lost real-time coordination with their support elements. During which Triad had to pause his advance, reposition his formation, and restore his command architecture before proceeding. 4 hours bought at the cost of the Mars installation, which was destroyed by return fire 11 minutes after its shot. All 63 crew members were evacuated to the underground Mars habitat beforehand. Li had calculated the response time to the nearest minute. The pattern was becoming visible to Triad's analysts by this point, and to their credit, they saw it. Humanity was not attempting to win engagements. It was attempting to impose costs, time, attention, formation cohesion, ammunition expenditure, on every phase of the advance. Each action was individually losable and collectively strategic. The word that Triad's chief analyst used in the recovered mission logs was one that xenolinguists had difficulty translating precisely. The closest approximation was erosion, but with a connotation not of physical wearing down, but of psychological wearing down. The sense that no ground gained is truly safe. The sense that the enemy is always making you pay for something. Triad convened his senior staff. The discussion, reconstructed from recovered logs, lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Triad made 2 decisions. First, he dispatched a communication drone toward Earth. Not a weapon. A message. It was the first time the Conclave had attempted to communicate with humanity. Second, he accelerated his timeline. He wanted the campaign concluded before whatever humanity was building toward, and his analysts were increasingly convinced humanity was building toward something, could be completed. The message arrived at Salwatch's communication receivers at 2204 UTC. It took 14 hours to decode. When the translation was complete, Okafor read it in the same flat silence with which he had read the targeting catalog 4 days earlier. The Conclave was not offering peace. They were offering terms of surrender. Specifically, the terms under which humanity would be permitted to exist as a managed civilization, under Conclave oversight. The management conditions included limitations on population growth, industrial development, and, critically, any further development of space travel capability beyond the Sol system. The message was, in its way, almost reasonable. It acknowledged that humanity had put up a more sophisticated resistance than expected. It suggested that this sophistication, properly managed, might even be valuable to the Conclave. It was the kind of offer a large power makes to a small one when the small one has made itself more trouble than expected but is still clearly going to lose. Okafor assembled the Security Council's emergency session. The debate lasted 4 hours. The vote was unanimous. Humanity's response was transmitted at 0900 UTC the following morning. It was 11 words. "We do not recognize your authority to make this offer." Triad read the response. He was quiet for a moment. Then he ordered the advance to resume. He had 29 hours to Earth orbit. There is a particular quality to the silence before a battle that every soldier across every human culture recognizes. It is not the absence of sound. Stations were active, systems were humming, people were talking at consoles, giving orders, running checks. The silence was something underneath all of that, a collective held breath, a shared awareness of threshold. 18,000 people were stationed in Earth-Moon space as the Conclave fleet entered its final approach corridor. Orbital platform crews, lunar base personnel, the staff of Solwatch and its sister stations, the crews of the 14 converted asteroid deflection platforms. They had all received OSE's briefing in some form, stripped down, task-specific, enough to understand their role but not so much that they had time to be paralyzed by the full picture. The full picture was paralysis-inducing. Even with everything humanity had deployed, even accounting for the attrition Triad's fleet had absorbed in the 3 previous engagements, the mathematical reality of the situation was that the Conclave's remaining 44 warships could reduce Earth's surface to uninhabitable conditions within a week if they chose to. The strategy OSE had designed was not built to prevent that outcome through force. It was built on a different premise entirely, one that had more in common with certain strains of deterrence theory and political philosophy than with conventional military strategy. The premise was this: the Conclave had come to eliminate a threat, not to conquer territory. They were not trying to colonize Earth. They were not trying to extract resources. They were trying to solve a strategic problem, the existence of a species their models said would eventually become dangerous. The only way to solve that problem, from their perspective, was either elimination or permanent control. Elimination required actually killing 8 billion people. Permanent control required ongoing military presence, resource commitment, and the constant attention of a civilization that, it was becoming clear, had not fully anticipated how expensive this operation would be. OSE's strategy was designed to make both options look like bad investments. The orbital platforms fired first. 14 rail systems, each launching in a staggered sequence timed to force Triad's defensive systems to track simultaneous threats from multiple vectors. The projectiles, tungsten slugs, 2 tons each, accelerated to a significant fraction of orbital velocity, were not sophisticated weapons. They required no guidance systems, no propulsion, no electronics that could be jammed. They were physics aimed carefully. 11 of the 180 slugs fired in the first salvo penetrated Conclave point defenses and struck the hulls of 3 warships. The penetration results varied. 2 impacts were effectively absorbed by armor that was, by human standards, extraordinary. 1 impact hit a weapons hardpoint on one of the larger warships and caused what the post-battle damage assessments would classify as significant mission kill damage. The ship was not destroyed, but it withdrew from the engagement line. Triad's fleet returned fire immediately. 4 of the 14 orbital platforms were destroyed in the first 10 minutes. The remaining 10 kept firing. The battle for Earth orbit lasted 11 hours. Those 11 hours have been analyzed, documented, and debated in every major military academy on Earth in the years since. They do not lend themselves to simple narrative because they were not simple. They were 11 hours of overlapping engagements, system failures, improvised responses, individual decisions made under extreme pressure and incomplete information, and the kind of cascading tactical consequences that only become legible in retrospect. A few moments stand out. At Hour 3, Orbital Platform 7, crewed by 14 people, commanded by a 29-year-old Norwegian officer named Lieutenant Commander Freya Halvorsen, was struck by weapons fire that disabled its propulsion system and destroyed its targeting computer. Unable to aim and unable to maneuver, Halvorsen's crew spent 40 minutes manually recalculating firing solutions using backup optical systems and a targeting algorithm running on a laptop. They fired 6 more salvos before the platform was destroyed. At Hour 6, 2 Conclave warships attempted to position themselves for a direct strike on the lunar surface, specifically the underground facilities that housed the Directorate's command infrastructure. A reserve element of 48 drones, held back from the initial deployment precisely for this contingency, intercepted them. The drones didn't destroy either ship, but they forced both vessels to spend 90 minutes dealing with the intercept rather than executing the strike. And during those 90 minutes, the Lunar Command infrastructure completed its transfer to backup locations 3 levels deeper in the regolith. At hour 9, the Conclave fleet paused. It was a pause that Triad's logs describe as a tactical recalibration, a reorganization of the fleet's damaged elements, a reassessment of ammunition expenditure and shield system status, and a communication back to Conclave Command requesting updated strategic guidance. The pause lasted 41 minutes. Those 41 minutes were the most important of the battle. Because in those 41 minutes, the first of 3 suborbital launch vehicles, each one carrying a payload that Dr. Osei's team had been assembling for 8 days in a facility under the Atacama Desert, successfully reached deployment altitude. The payload was not a weapon. Not in the traditional sense. It was a communication system. Specifically, a long-range quantum entanglement communication relay of a type that humanity had been quietly developing for 12 years. The technology was not fully understood. It worked erratically in testing and only marginally better in deployment. But marginally better was enough. The relay, once deployed, opened a direct channel to a specific address, one that Sawatch's intercepted communications had identified as belonging to a faction within the Conclave that had voted against Resolution 7 Gamma. The 3 dissenting votes. Osei had not built her strategy around weapons. She had built it around the 9-3 vote, specifically, around the recognition that a 9-3 vote is not unanimity, and that a campaign that was proving more expensive than projected might give the 3 dissenters something to work with. Okafor himself took the communication channel when it opened. He did not know who was on the other end. He did not know whether the channel was monitored by the majority. He did not know if anything he said would matter. He had a brief window, a shaky connection, and 60 years of humanity's complicated, contradictory, occasionally catastrophic but persistently resilient history to work with. He started talking. The 3 dissenters on the Conclave resolution had not voted against it out of sympathy for humanity. They were not, by any measure, sentimental beings. Counselor Marin of the Veth Collective had opposed Resolution 7 Gamma on the grounds that preemptive elimination of a pre-spaceflight civilization would set a precedent that could eventually be used against the Veth themselves. Counselor Perith of the Duro Compact had argued that the predictive models were insufficiently precise to justify the resource expenditure. Counselor Saya of the Lien Sovereignty had simply believed the timeline was wrong, that humanity would need 500 years to become a significant threat, not 300, and that the Conclave was creating the very adversary it feared by acting too soon. None of them had argued that humanity deserved to live. They had argued that killing humanity was a strategic mistake. That distinction mattered because it meant that what Okafor needed to give them was not a moral argument. It was a strategic one. He had been thinking about it for 2 days. The channel held for 22 minutes before the encryption degraded. Okafor was not a diplomat. He had no training in xenolinguistics and was communicating through a translation system that had been assembled in 5 days from Sawatch's intercepted data corpus. There were gaps. There were misunderstandings that only became apparent later. The exchange was imperfect in ways that could have been catastrophic and, in 2 instances, nearly were. But the core argument got through. Okafor did not argue that humanity was peaceful. He could not have argued that credibly, and he was honest enough not to try. He did not argue that humanity would never become a threat. The models that predicted otherwise were based on real data. He argued 3 things. First, the campaign had cost the Conclave more than the vote sponsors had projected, and the final accounting was not yet complete. Humanity had demonstrated the ability to impose asymmetric costs on a superior force. Elimination of a species that had not yet reached its full technological development would be one cost. Elimination of that species after another 50 or 100 years of development would be qualitatively different, not merely quantitatively larger. Second, the Conclave's current approach was creating the adversarial conditions it feared. A humanity that survived this campaign, even a diminished, damaged humanity, would organize every aspect of its civilization around the single strategic objective of never being vulnerable again. The models that predicted human danger assumed human development under normal conditions. The models had not run the scenario in which humanity spent the next 2 centuries in a war footing, with unified political purpose, focused entirely on interstellar military capability. Third, and this was the argument that Osei had built and that Okafor delivered with everything he had, the 3 dissenters had been right about one thing and right about it in a way that was more important than they knew. The timeline was wrong. but it was wrong in both directions. Humanity was further from being a long-range threat than the majority believed. It was also further along in certain specific capabilities than the majority believed. Capabilities that, if developed cooperatively rather than in opposition, could be worth more to the conclave than the problem of their source. He named 3 specific technologies. He did not bluff about what they were or what stage of development they had reached. He had calculated, carefully, that honesty was more credible and therefore more strategically effective than exaggeration. Then he waited. The 22 minutes ended. The channel went silent. Okafor returned to the Battle Coordination Center, where the conclave fleet's pause had ended and the engagement had resumed. The remaining 7 orbital platforms were being systematically destroyed. Lunar surface installations were taking fire. The window for the strategy to work was narrowing toward a point where it wouldn't matter anymore. He had done what he could do. Now the variables were outside his control. That was, for a man of Okafor's temperament, the hardest part. What happened within the conclave fleet over the following 6 hours is reconstructed from the mission logs recovered after the conflict's resolution. The picture is incomplete. Triad kept some records in formats that human linguists have still not fully decoded, but the broad strokes are clear. Triad received a communication from Conclave Command at hour 14 of the Earth orbit battle. The communication was not, as he had expected, updated engagement authorization. It was a hold order. A temporary cessation of offensive operations pending review. The language of the communication was bureaucratic. The conclave communicated in bureaucratic language even in crisis. But Triad was experienced enough to read what was underneath it. The 3 dissenters had moved. They had formally requested an emergency review of the campaign's cost-benefit assessment in light of current operational data. Under conclave procedure, such a request, if seconded by a 4th council member, triggered a mandatory pause. It had been seconded. Someone from the majority had crossed. Triad was not given the name. He was given the hold order and 72 hours to comply or formally contest. He complied. He was a product of the conclave system, and the system said pause. His fleet held position 40,000 kilometers from Earth. For 72 hours the solar system breathed. What broke in those 72 hours was not the conclave's resolve to manage the humanity problem. That resolve remained. What broke was the consensus that this particular campaign at this particular time was the right method. The cost assessment was real. 17 warships had sustained damage ranging from moderate to severe. 3 had been withdrawn from the engagement line. The drone network had been more effective than projected, not in destroying ships, but in the cumulative attrition of attention, ammunition, and time. The rail platforms had demonstrated a kinetic capability that Triad's pre-campaign assessments had underestimated. The Mars installation's precision strike had revealed an electronic warfare and targeting sophistication that was frankly ahead of what the intelligence had predicted. And then there was the communication. Okafor's 3 arguments had not convinced anyone that humanity deserved mercy. They had done something more useful. They had given the dissenters a framework to argue that the campaign was a strategic miscalculation, and they had given the 4th crossover vote a credible alternative to advocate for. That alternative was not peace. It was delay and re-evaluation, and the possibility of a different kind of engagement. On the 5th day of the hold, the conclave transmitted a new message. This one was addressed to the United Earth Government, an organization that technically did not yet exist, but that humanity had quietly begun constituting in an emergency session the previous day, because someone had pointed out that you couldn't negotiate as a species if you didn't have a single body empowered to negotiate on behalf of the species. The message requested formal talks. It was not an apology. It was not an admission of error. It contained no expression of regret for the thousands of casualties humanity had suffered or the orbital infrastructure that had been destroyed. But it was a message, addressed to humanity, asking for a conversation. Okafor read it in his office, alone at 0300 in the morning. He had been awake for 31 hours. He would later say that what he felt in that moment was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated, the recognition that the hardest part was not yet over, but that the part that required fighting with everything you had was, perhaps, done. He authorized a response. Formal. Measured. Accepting the invitation. Then he went to sleep for 5 hours because he was 62 years old and his body had earned it. The negotiations took place aboard a neutral station, a conclave installation in the asteroid belt that had been designated as a neutral facility under conclave law, which was convenient because it meant the conclave was familiar with it and humanity was not, a structural asymmetry that the human delegation spent the first 3 days quietly mapping and adjusting for. The human delegation was 11 people. It included 2 diplomats, 3 scientists, an economist, a military strategist, Dr. Osei, who had earned her seat beyond any possible argument, a historian, a philosopher, and 2 people whose roles were described in the official manifest as general advisory, but who were, in practical terms, Okafor's eyes and ears on everything that wasn't being said in the formal sessions. The conclave sent 43. They had not expected humanity to bring 11. There was a long pause when the delegations first assembled in the station's primary conference space, a pause that the conclave's representatives almost certainly read as appropriate deference to their numbers, and that the human delegation was using to count seats, assess sight lines, and note which of the 43 were taking notes and which were simply present for effect. Old habits. The formal agenda had 7 items. The conclave's version of the agenda had been transmitted in advance. It was framed around the concept of resolution of the Sol system instability event, which was their description of the campaign they had launched. Humanity had proposed a counter-agenda with different framing. The debate over whose agenda to use consumed the first 2 days. It sounds trivial. It was not. Language shapes negotiation. The conclave's framing positioned humanity as the source of instability, the problem requiring resolution. Humanity's framing positioned the campaign as an act of aggression requiring accountability. Neither side fully accepted the other's frame. The eventual compromise was a neutral descriptor so bloodlessly bureaucratic that it meant almost nothing, which was, diplomatically, a kind of progress. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the historian on the human delegation, observed in her personal notes that the framing argument bore a striking structural resemblance to armistice negotiations from several of humanity's major 20th-century conflicts. The powerful party wanting language that preserved the narrative of legitimacy. The less powerful party wanting language that established a record of violation. Both parties eventually settling for language that a graduate student could later interpret either way because the point of getting to the table was to get to the table, not to win the argument about the table. She did not share this observation with the conclave delegation. She shared it with Osei over terrible coffee at 2 a.m. on day 4, and Osei wrote a single word in the margin of Tanaka's notes. Exactly. The substantive negotiations were conducted primarily between 3 of the conclave's representatives, who turned out to be, in effect, the 3 dissenters and the crossover votes representatives, and Okafor, Osei, and the 2 diplomats. The other 39 conclave representatives were a combination of technical experts, silent observers, and what the human delegation eventually concluded were factional representatives whose primary function was to ensure their faction's interests were considered without necessarily contributing to the conversation. The human delegation had 4 non-negotiable positions. They had been developed over 3 days of closed-door sessions during the hold period and had been approved by the emergency United Earth government with a unanimity that none of the delegates took for granted. They all understood that the unanimity was a product of crisis, not consensus, and that it would not survive the crisis intact. Position 1. The conclave would formally acknowledge that Resolution 7 Gamma had been enacted without prior communication, warning, or opportunity for diplomatic engagement, and that this constituted a violation of what humanity considered the minimum standard for civilized conduct between technological species. Position 2. Humanity would not accept any permanent restriction on its technological or space travel development as a condition of the agreement. Position 3. Any future monitoring of humanity by conclave intelligence assets would require mutual disclosure. Humanity would know it was being watched. Position 4. The agreement would not be bilateral. It would be registered with whatever neutral third-party institution the conclave recognized as a legitimate record keeper. Humanity was not interested in a deal that only the conclave's internal records showed existed. The conclave found Position 1 distasteful and Positions 2 and 4 alarming. Position 3 they found almost philosophically incomprehensible. The idea of a monitored party knowing they were monitored conflicted with fundamental assumptions in their intelligence doctrine. The debates on each point were long. They were, at times, tense in ways that the formal records do not fully capture. On day 9, the negotiations came close to breaking down entirely over Position 2. The conclave representatives argued with evident conviction that permitting unrestricted human technological development was precisely the problem Resolution 7 Gamma had been designed to address, and that agreeing to it was tantamount to agreeing to their own eventual strategic degradation. Osei's response to that argument is the most documented exchange of the entire negotiation. She spoke for 40 minutes. The translation was imperfect. But the core of what she said was this. The conclave's predictive models had been built on observed data about humanity's development under one particular condition. A humanity that did not know it was being observed, did not know other civilizations existed, and was developing its capabilities in the context of its own internal dynamics. Those models were now obsolete. The event of the last 3 weeks had changed the condition. Humanity now knew. Everything the models had predicted about human behavior assumed a humanity that didn't know what humanity now knew. The question was not what a humanity developing in isolation might eventually become. That humanity was gone. The question was what a humanity that had just survived a first contact event that began with a preemptive military strike would do next. The conclave could model that too, she suggested. She was confident the results would tell them that restricting that humanity's development was less strategically sound than engaging it. The room was quiet for a long time after she finished. The agreement that was eventually reached was not a peace treaty in the traditional sense. It was a framework, a formal document establishing the terms under which humanity and the conclave would interact going forward, the mechanisms by which disputes would be escalated before they became military actions, and the mutual acknowledgments that made the framework politically survivable for both parties. The conclave acknowledged, in language that had been negotiated word by word over 2 days, that Resolution 7 Gamma had been enacted without prior diplomatic engagement. It did not use the word wrong. The closest translation was something like, premature in its escalation to military measures. Humanity accepted that language. Okafor had been the one to approve it. When asked later why he had accepted what many considered inadequate accountability language, he said, because the goal was never to be right. The goal was to be safer than we were before. Humanity's technological development was not restricted. The monitoring disclosure provision was accepted in a modified form. The conclave would notify a designated human authority of any intelligence-gathering operations, with certain defined exceptions for emergency assessment scenarios that the human legal team spent 3 days successfully limiting. And humanity was given an observer seat on the conclave's open council sessions. Non-voting, limited in scope, but real. A seat. A presence. A voice in the room. It was the most the 3 dissenters could deliver and still hold the crossover vote. It was more than anyone in the human delegation had realistically expected 4 weeks earlier. Tanaka noted in her diary that evening, "We came here as a species that had never spoken to another civilization. We are leaving as a species that the most powerful political body in the known galaxy has officially acknowledged as a party worth negotiating with. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything." The conclave fleet withdrew from the Sol system on day 31 of the crisis. It left at the same unhurried pace it had arrived. No gesture of defeat, no acknowledgement of what the withdrawal meant. Triad's fleet simply reversed its formation, retraced its approach corridor, and crossed the heliopause back into interstellar space. His mission logs, recovered years later through the information-sharing protocols established under the framework agreement, show no entry for the withdrawal itself. The last operational note before the heliopause crossing reads, "Campaign status, inconclusive. Reassigned per council directive." Inconclusive. It is, perhaps, the most diplomatic word in the recovered record. On Earth, the mood in the days following the withdrawal defied easy description. There was relief, genuine, physical relief of the kind that only manifests after prolonged fear, the particular looseness of shoulders and depth of breath that comes when a held tension finally releases. There was grief, too, for the dead, 2,347 in the orbital battle, 63 from the Mars installation, officially 0 since they had been evacuated, but the installation itself and everything in it was gone, and that carried its own weight. And a number of civilians in 3 cities that had experienced infrastructure failures when orbital debris had entered atmospheric re-entry trajectories that were not fully controlled. The total was lower than anyone had feared. It was not low enough to prevent grief. And there was something else, harder to name, quieter than either the relief or the grief, but more persistent than both. The emergency United Earth government that had been constituted in crisis did not dissolve when the crisis ended. That had been the assumption, that it was a temporary structure, a wartime coordination body that would sunset when the wartime need passed. What happened instead was a series of votes in the Security Council, the General Assembly, and eventually national legislatures on every inhabited continent, that were less about the architecture of the new institution than about the recognition that the world before March 14th was not coming back. Humanity had learned something about itself that could not be unlearned. It had learned that the universe was populated. It had learned that population was not friendly by default. It had learned that its own solar system, which had felt, for all of human history, like the entirety of existence, was a single unremarkable coordinate in a political landscape of civilizations so old they had been traveling between stars before humanity had developed writing. And it had learned, this was the piece that changed things most profoundly, that it was possible to sit at the table with those civilizations. Not as an equal, not yet, not by most measures. But as a party. As a voice. As something that had made itself, through cost and cleverness and an almost stubborn refusal to accept the terms of the problem as it had been handed to them, relevant. The United Earth government was ratified as a permanent institution 14 months after the withdrawal. It had limited authority, sovereignty over interstellar affairs, defense coordination and treaty obligations, while domestic governance remained with member states. It was messy, politically contentious, and immediately imperfect in a dozen ways that everyone involved was loudly aware of. It was also real. And permanent. And it had teeth, which was the thing that mattered most. Admiral Okafor retired from active service 8 months after the withdrawal. He gave no retirement speech. He published no memoir. He granted one interview to a journalist from the Lagos Tribune that lasted 40 minutes and covered mostly technical aspects of the crisis response. Near the end, the journalist asked him what he thought the most important thing humanity had done in those 31 days was. He thought about it for a while. "We didn't try to win," he said. "We tried to make winning too expensive for them." Those are different things, and knowing the difference is the thing that kept this from being a catastrophe. The journalist asked if he thought it was over. "No," he said without hesitation. "The conclave still has that vote on record. The models that produced it are still running. There are going to be more conversations, and some of them are going to be very difficult, and we need to be better prepared for them than we were for this one." He paused. "But we'll be in the room for those conversations. That's new. That matters." He declined to say anything more on the subject and spent the remainder of the interview talking about the engineering specifications of the orbital rail platforms. Dr. Osei went back to her research position at the Accra Institute for Strategic Studies. She published a paper 14 months after the withdrawal titled Asymmetric Deterrence in Multi-Species Political Environments, a case study. It was dry, dense, technically rigorous, and cited by every military academy on Earth and, eventually, in 2 of the conclave's own strategic analysis publications, something that was discovered 5 years later and caused a considerable amount of quiet satisfaction in certain circles. She also served on the committee that designed humanity's new deep space early warning network, the one that replaced SAWatch with something 20 times larger, built from the beginning to detect not just approaching fleets but communication patterns, political shifts, and the early indicators of conclave policy changes that might, with enough warning time, be addressed diplomatically before they became military problems. The network was called Horizon. Its motto, selected by committee after 3 weeks of debate, was a single line from a document that Tanaka had found in her research, a fragment from an ancient Earth treaty that no one could quite identify. "We have come this far by watching carefully." The observer seat on the conclave's open council was first occupied 6 months after the framework agreement was ratified. The delegate was a woman named Counselor Adiz Obi, a diplomat who had spent 20 years working in the most difficult bilateral negotiations on Earth and who had been chosen, according to the selection committee's internal notes, because she had the specific quality of being impossible to intimidate without being impossible to talk to. Her first session was largely procedural. She did not speak. She listened, watched, and afterward filed a 40-page analysis of everything she had observed. Her second session she asked one question. It was a question about the predictive models, specifically about the update cycle. How frequently were they recalibrated against observed data? What was the protocol when observed behavior consistently deviated from model predictions? The question created a silence in the chamber that lasted several seconds, which is, in conclave deliberative culture, an extraordinary pause. One of the dissenters, Counselor Saya of the Lien Sovereignty, answered it carefully and at length. At the end of the session, Saya approached Counselor Obi in what human observers read as a deliberate, considered gesture. "You ask good questions," Saya said through the translator. "I have a good reason to," Obi said. "What happened over the following decades is a longer story, one with its own crises and negotiations, its own moments of near disaster and unexpected progress, its own cast of human and non-human characters navigating a political landscape that neither species fully understood. But the 31 days of the Soul Crisis, as it came to be called, established something that persisted through all of it. Humanity had been discovered by the galaxy at the worst possible moment, with no warning, no relationship, no leverage, no preparation sufficient to the scale of the threat. It had responded not with the God mode invincibility of legend but with something more human and more real, careful thinking under pressure, the willingness to absorb costs in service of a longer strategy, the instinct to find leverage where none was supposed to exist, and the stubborn insistence on being present in the conversation rather than the subject of it. The Conclave's models had never captured that last quality. They had measured adaptability, technological development rate, conflict escalation patterns. They had not figured out how to quantify what it looked like when a species decided, collectively and under fire, that it was not going to accept the terms of the problem as handed to it. That quality had no name in the Conclave's taxonomy. Humanity, characteristically, had several names for it. The simplest one was the one Okafor had used, that first morning, when he had looked at a targeting catalog listing his species among its entries and had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had asked what they had. He had taken inventory. He had started working with what was real. That was what humanity was, underneath all the models and all the predictions and all the fear that had driven 9 civilizations to vote for its elimination before it had ever left its own sun. It was a species that, when handed a problem it wasn't supposed to be able to solve, got very quiet, counted what it had and got to work. The galaxy, over time, would come to understand that. The Sol Crisis, 2271. 31 days. It was the most important month in human history. It was also, as it turned out, just the beginning.